Hello, everybody. So welcome to the webinar today on the operational impacts of DER integration on the SWIS network. My name is Kelvin Say. I'm a research fellow at the Energy Transition Hub here at the University of Melbourne, where I specialise on the market integration of customer energy assets. So before we begin, please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we're joining this webinar and in paying my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So this webinar is being hosted by the Climate Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub, and it's the 7th in a series of 8 webinars on consumer-centric energy, and it's sponsored by the Victorian Clean Technology Fund. So this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the Climate Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub websites by tomorrow. So at the later part of this webinar will be run as a Q&A session, so please submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And please also upvote any questions that you'd particularly like to be answered. So I'd like to just introduce our speaker. So Dr. Julius Susanto is a principal engineer at AEMO in Western Australia, working in an operational role within the system management function. He has over 19 years of experience in power systems analysis, design and operations, and is a 2020 Churchill Fellow. So without further ado, the floor is now yours, Julius.
Thanks, Kelvin. So hopefully the screen's come up now. And as Kelvin said, I work for the Australian Energy Market Operator in Western Australia. And we operate the Southwest Interconnected System, which is the largest grid in Western Australia. And this presentation really is about what distributed energy resources has done to our operations and the impacts that it has in integrating such large volumes of DER. So I'd just like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on Aboriginal land, the land of the Whadjuk people, where I'm at in Perth, of the Noongar Nation, and I pay respects to their elders past, present and future. So the outline of this talk, I'd be just going through what the SWIS is first, and some of the introduction to the SWIS, and also just how rooftop PV integration has occurred on the SWIS. And then I will talk about the operational impacts of this DER integration, and these are sort of the main issues that I'll be going through. So low load issues, system load volatility, ramping and cycling, emerging contingency risks, the impact on UFLS, and impact on system restart. So just to begin with, the Southwest Interconnected System is a medium-scale islanded power system that serves 1.2 million customers in the southwest of Western Australia. So this whole area here. So you have the Perth metro area is the main load centre, but it does extend all the way up to Geraldton and all the way down to Albany. And over east here is the eastern Gulf, is Kalgoorlie, and there's a long 220 kV line that comes from Mooja, which is the traditional coal-fired power plant area of Perth. So this is the coal basin here, the Collie Coal Basin, and that provides most of the coal-fired power plants in the SWIS. So the peak demand in the SWIS is only 4.3 gigawatts. But if you look at the size of the area it covers, it's 261,000 kilometres, square kilometres, and that's larger than the land area of the UK, and their system has 59 gigawatts of peak demand. So it's a very sparsely, it's a sparse grid with a small amount of demand. And incidentally, it's probably one of the smallest wholesale electricity markets that's islanded in the world, if not the smallest. There are 6,000 kilometres of transmission lines and 64,000 kilometres of distribution lines. So this is what system load looks like in the SWIS, and is sort of monthly averages from 2019 to 2020. And I'll just let it run for a bit, but I guess what you will notice is that the load profiles change throughout the year, and they're very highly dependent on temperature. And so as we come towards January, you will see that it becomes a single peak in the summer periods, and then it moves towards a two-peak morning and evening peak. Whereas during the summer, it basically just flattens out to one single evening peak. And you can see the effects of DER quite prominently when sort of the September, October, November period, where the duck curve affects. In the middle of the day, the operational load gets hollowed out by rooftop PV. And as you can see, as we move towards sort of the winter months and then September, October, you can see some of the duck curve effects occurring. In terms of generation mix, so just got here a couple pie charts on what energy is being generated in the SWIS. And you can see from in 2018, it's mainly coal and gas being generated with a little bit of wind. And as we get through the years, it's mainly still coal and gas, but we're getting more and more rooftop PV, utility scale solar and wind. So last year, we're getting towards 25% basically of renewable energy into the grid, and interestingly enough, the share of coal is really starting to drop off from 45%, almost half, to now sort of a third of all energy produced in the SWIS. Whereas gas is sort of pretty much remained constant, about 40%. And in terms of the changes to the generation mix, you can probably see year to year how it's changed. But from a time of day perspective, this has come from the quarterly energy dynamics report from the difference between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the fourth quarter of 2020. And you can see that rooftop PV, which is this sort of light yellow color, has really increased by 150, 200 megawatts in the middle of the day. And it's really crowded out coal and gas in the middle of the day, as well as all this new wind and grid solar. So last year we actually had about 400, 500 megawatts of wind come in, and another 100 megawatts of 140 odd megawatts of new solar come in. So utility scale solar, I mean. So that's where all this change in growth has come from. And in terms of DER, rooftop PV in the SWIS has really come from nothing in 2009 to now being 1.5, 1.6 gigawatts of capacity, of installed capacity. And incidentally, we have about 1.6, 1.5, 1.6 gigawatts of coal. So now we're getting almost towards parity in terms of installed capacity of rooftop PV and coal capacity. And so that was at the end of December 2020, and I'm sure it's, I think our estimates right now is something like 1.65 gigawatts. And this is incidentally from the WA DER data dashboard register, and that's just recently released. So you can sort of click on this and follow the charts and the additions of rooftop PV. This is the growth in rooftop PV year on year, basically the same as chart as before, but split by how much it's grown in a year. And you can see it's actually been growing. So year on year, we're actually just getting more and more rooftop PV additions, and so hasn't really flattened out as much as we were expecting. And this is just a slide for showing the relative per capita rooftop PV capacity in different states in Australia. And I should point out here that the population of WA includes, a lot of a couple 100,000 people outside of the SWIS area. So this is probably not as reflective of rooftop PV capacity per capita in WA, but it's because it only counts for SWIS PV capacity. But it's just here to show in relative terms that WA is punching pretty much above its weight in terms of where it sits in the league table of PV uptake in Australia. So it's pretty high, and South Australia and Queensland are obviously high, but obviously also connected to the NEM. So as an island network, this is pretty high. And just talking about the duck curve, so I was talking before that the operational demand in the middle of the day is getting lower and lower due to the DER, and this is just an illustration of why that is, and how DER is basically coming up, producing all this electricity that is consumed locally by the loads, and therefore what we see on the power system side or the system operator end is quite a lot lower load net of the DER. This is just a picture from August 2020, and I just should note that the records have actually been broken twice since then, once in October and just recently in March. And so the factors affecting this belly of the duck in WA is obviously clear skies. You've got to have very clear skies around the Perth metro area specifically. Ambient temperatures are very key. So mild daytime temperatures between 20 and 25 degrees is really a comfortable temperature and requires little air conditioning or heating. And it's also very cool, and you get really good PV performance. And the position of the sun also matters. So as you get more towards the summer solstice, you're going to get better solar declination angle and better PV output. And the day of the week also matters for the system load, because the system load is lower on weekends. So you really see this belly of the duck get lower and lower on a Sunday. And what we normally see is a mild sunny day on a Sunday in spring. So between September and October is really the sweet spot. So this is when all these four sort of factors come into play. I'll just go through the evolution of the duck curve from 2016 till now, and this is a forecast that we made back in 2018, where 2016, 2017, 18 were actually actual values, and we just sort of forecasted down based on just more like linear extrapolations of PV of DER growth at the time. And here is what the actuals were, and interestingly enough, they were pretty close. So if you look at the 2021, this is from March, you can see it's pretty close to the mark that we were estimating or forecasting back in 2018. And so the growth rate in PV has been relatively steady and linear. So now, just going through all of the introductory sections on the SWIS and DER growth in the SWIS, and then just talking now about the operational impacts of DER integration. So low load issues. So as we said before, the duck curve causes low minimum demands in the middle of the day. And how does this cause system operability issues? So this is what I'm going to go through now. So we have low system load due to excess DER. So there's more DER than there is load, and that's being pushed into the network, into the system. And we're seeing now that manifest as low system demands. And what happens is that causes synchronous generators, thermal generators specifically, more so to decommit. So they decommit in two ways. Firstly, they just synchronous generators become out of merit in the bid stack as the low loads manifest themselves, and other renewables which are cheaper can stay in merit while synchronous machines sort of drop out. And also you have just economic decommitment of base load plants. And this is a decision that is made before the trading intervals begin. And this may be made 1 or 2 days beforehand, where a coal-fired power plant or a combined cycle gas power plant will decommit so that it doesn't have to bid in their minimum generation at the market floor and then lose money in these periods. So because of all these decommitments, what we're seeing now is these impacts on system operability. So there's issues related to voltage control, low inertia and frequency stability, and system strength. So I'm just going to go through each of these three factors individually. So in terms of voltage control, the issues we have at low daytime system loads is we have DER as well as underground cables, interestingly enough. So WA actually has had large campaigns of undergrounding all the suburbs, and these cables just have excess capacitance, and they're just pushing up local voltages in the middle of the day. And so you can see here all this DER coming in, voltages coming up, and zone substation transformers, their tap changes are now moving to their minimum tap and to control these voltages. And as a result, all these reactive power is now moving out into the transmission system. So this is your distribution system. Now all this Q is going out into the transmission system upstream. And then also, because you've got not that much load on the system, all these transmission lines, high voltage transmission lines, also have a net injection of reactive power. So all the capacitance in the transmission lines are now injecting reactive power into the system. And then all of this has to be soaked up by synchronous machines, like generators, as well as wind generators and solar generators also can soak up reactive power, SVCs and reactive plants. So here's a shunt reactor to make sure that the transmission voltages operate within limits. Now, what's happening though is as the synchronous generators decommit, we're having less and less options for controlling and absorbing reactive power in the system, and we're at higher risk of over voltages in the transmission network. We're already seeing sort of over voltages occurring in the distribution network, and every now and again we are seeing some voltages, creep up to higher levels in the transmission system. And I guess one of the problems with high voltages in the transmission system is that it's actually hard to get them back lower, because once you get the voltages higher, then the capacitance of from the transmission lines also increases, or the reactive power from the capacitance from the transmission lines also increases, and it gets harder as the voltages go higher. So what we try to do is really try and control the voltages to lower voltages where we can within a band, and prevent them from getting up more towards like those limits, which is like 1.1 per unit. And we try and sort of keep them below 1.06, 1.07. So in terms of voltage control, the generator reactive power outputs, this is an example of how they've changed between the peak and the minimum load. So during peak load, this is a slide from Western Power from a T-Dog workshop recently, and we had a near system peak load of about 4,070 megawatts early this year, and you can see the generators are basically injecting 265 megawatts of megabars of reactive power. And you can see also that at the load end, they're also absorbing 167 MBars, so it's lagging power factors. And transmission customers, they tend to stay the same. Now, you compare this to the minimum load day, which is on the 14th of March. So this is our record minimum load day at the moment. Now the loads themselves are injecting bars, and also the generators are also now absorbing a lot of bars. So you can see here the difference between a peak and a minimum load day. And as you get less and less generation, you probably still have to absorb the same amount of bars, but you have less generators doing it. And that's probably where some of the issues are occurring. However, Western Power have actually committed to installing quite a lot of shunt reactors in the system. And they're committed to installing almost 500 MBars, and with probably about 300 MBars already installed. And so right now, we don't have too much of a problem. So at one point last year or the year before, we were having to actually switch out transmission lines lightly loaded transmission lines that were injecting a lot of Vs. So now we're having to not do that as often. We'll see in October, September, October, but right now it's been pretty good. And with more transmission level shunt reactors coming in, that also improve the situation. And by way of sort of ongoing analysis, there is now sort of a regular operational review by both AEMO and Western Power, and the longer term requirements are now incorporated into Western Power's network planning process. So this issue seems to have been mitigated quite well. So the second issue is relating to low inertia and frequency stability. So system inertia tends to just decrease at low loads, and that's because synchronous planners decommitting as they come out of merit or decommit. And you can see here, this is a histogram of the inertia ranges between 2017 and 2020. And the typical inertia range is sort of in that 12,000 to 17,000. I should say this is all just generator inertia, so we're not we're excluding the load side inertia of this, but this is fairly it would be fairly proportional to the generator side inertia. And you can see the maximum inertia is sort of 24,700 megawatt seconds, and the minimum inertia is 7,800. And it has been creeping this way, I would say, from years gone by. If you look at 2017, you see the blue bits here, they're more on this side, and the 2020, the red slide is more red bits are just more on the left side. And yeah, that's your minimum inertia. And I guess the point here to make is that ceteris paribus, so all things being equal, the lower the inertia, the more sensitive it is to frequency disturbances. So if you had a generator contingency, or generator just tripping, then with everything else being equal, so let's say all these primary frequency response and so forth is the same, then a small system, a 5 gigawatt second system, has a lot more frequency deviation than a 10, 15, or a 20 gigawatt system. So we're sitting around this area here. And as we get lower and lower, we are sort of seeing more frequency stability sensitivities. So in terms of mitigations, what we've done is AEMO developed and deployed a real-time frequency stability tool. And this is like a situational awareness tool in the control room that allows the controllers to look at the system frequency stability in real time and make changes in dispatch when there's some security risks. So we check the tool after every generator contingency and fine tune it. So far it's been pretty good. So here's some examples of the predictions that the RTFS has made versus actual frequency response. So this is a 244 megawatt gas-fired generator trip, and the RTFS has fairly well predicted the actual frequency response. And it's nice, obviously, that it's a bit more conservative, and so far it's always been a little bit more conservative than actual responses. So we do get IPP responses in the actual frequency response. So as you can see here, this is the actual primary frequency response, and you can see that there's more things happening from an IPP's perspective than what you would expect from what we predict, which we only use what we can rely on in terms of contracted spinning reserve. Another example is a coal-fired generator at 175 megawatts, and again, RTFS is fairly accurate in the sense that we're within 0.1, 0.2 hertz, and the nadir, and it's conservative, which so far is so good. So in terms of ongoing analysis, we're doing some work right now and working out what is the minimum number of generators that we need online to meet system security requirements. So as we get lower and lower system loads, we start to have to think about what kind of minimum synchronous machine floors that we need to put in place, or inertia floors. So far we haven't hit them yet, but the studies are ongoing, and it's actually going to be quite possible that frequency stability is not really the main driver for the synchronous machine flaws, and could be something like system strength. But we haven't really quite got there yet. So on system strength, and similar to inertia, system strength does go down as thermal plant becomes out of merit or decommissions. And this is just because synchronous machines are a good source of fault current. And we actually haven't seen a great deal of system strength issues in the SWIS in practice, but our screening studies have indicated that there are some risks in sort of the rural areas of the SWIS, the ones that are less meshed. If you go back to that, the geographic diagram of the SWIS, the Greater Perth metro area is actually very meshed in terms of transmission lines, and quite a lot of generation there as well. And so they're quite high by way of short circuit current. And so we don't see too many short system strength issues there. However, as you get up to the north and as you get out to the east, especially when you have some large wind farms and large solar farms, this is sort of where the risks of the screening studies indicate where there are risks, and particularly when the network is not intact. So when you have one transmission line outage, that you start radializing certain areas, and that really does decrease the fault level in these areas. So studies are currently being undertaken by Western Power to assess the risks in more detail. So we're supporting Western Power where we can, but I think this is mainly the work that they're doing. So they're building the EMT models. So that was the issues related to low system load. Now let's just talk about issues that we're seeing through low volatility. So once we see cloud bands come through the SWIS, we can see quite a lot of swings in DER output. And I just wanted to put this slide up here because it's hard to imagine that you can have cloud bands that cover, large areas of the state. And the fact is you do. And, before I came to AIM, I wasn't aware that you could have weather patterns this large and moving very quickly. And so you can have these really large cloud formations, and this would cover the whole SWIS pretty much, and they're moving. And so you can see they're also banded. So there's areas there of clear skies as well. And so the assumption that you have some geographic diversity in rooftop PV, or even just in PV in general, doesn't really hold sometimes. And we're seeing this, it's not a everyday event, but we're seeing it every few months that you might have quite a lot of large cloud formations that are causing volatility. And so this specific screenshot is from a specific day as well, which I'll talk about in the next slide. How we manage this though is we use weather forecasting tools. So we've got a couple of weather forecasting services that we use, and they forecast both the system load as well as rooftop PV or irradiance in the SWIS. And where we can, if we can see that clouds are coming, our controllers would basically start preparing the fleet, and if necessary, we'll call up for additional load following services. So in the NEM, this is NEM FCAS regulation, raise and lower services. However, one of our problems is one of rapidly forming clouds over the Perth Metro, and they can cause really large swings to happen, and they're difficult to forecast. So I've got a case study of that as well. And I do say the Perth Metro because most of the PV is in the Perth Metro. So if you cover the Perth Metro, then you're basically covering a lot of the PV in the SWIS. So that screenshot was actually from this day, the 18th of August of 2018, where you had large cloud bands with clear skies in between, and they were moving between 9 AM and 3 PM. And so this actually resulted in large system load swings of up to 300 megawatts, and this is what you were seeing. Is on that brown curve is the system load. You can see it's up at 2200 at what's that, about 11 a.m., 11:30, and then goes down to over 1900 at 11:30, so in half an hour, and then it's going up and down. So you can see this is not easy to manage from a system operator perspective, and it's the load forecasts are not really showing this either for the most part. And by comparison, the green curve is from 3 days earlier. Oh, yeah, 3 days earlier. So this should be October, not August. And you can see on a clear sky day, it's quite consistent, the impact of DER, whereas on these mixed sky volatile days, they do go up down quite a lot. This is an example of the really rapid cloud formation that occurred in last month in the middle of March. And just have a look here at around 1 o'clock, you can see this is the Greater Perth area in the box, and just clouds form very quickly. And then in that box, you have clear skies in the morning, and then all of a sudden, clouds are forming. And you can see that in the trace of Rooftop PV, around 1 o'clock, it just drops off about 400 megawatts in 15 minutes. And that actually looked a lot like a generator contingency. So we were not prepared for it in terms of real-time control, and that frequency went down to 49.5 hertz. We actually had to use spinning reserve or FCAS contingency rate to bring this frequency back up. And one of the questions that people are asking is, what happened to the forecasts? I guess we have these continuous data feeds from, as I said, a couple weather forecast providers that provide these short-term PV forecasts. And during the event, we had hour and 30-meter ahead forecasts, and they really didn't provide that much guidance in terms of the depth of the drop. So these are the 3 forecast providers at 12 o'clock. And you can see one forecast was showing basically a clear sky day, and the other forecasts were just showing mild drops. This is probably the best forecast. We're showing a drop, and at 12:30 they did actually adjust their forecast. These two didn't, but this one adjusted its forecast down a little bit, but not to the extent that the controllers could see that there was a big problem or a big issue coming up. And again, these rapid cloud formations are pretty hard to forecast because they occur. They're not cloud bands. They just sort of form above the metro area. So it is difficult to pick up these 15-minute variations. And we are currently working with our weather providers right now to see whether we can make improvements in short-term forecasting, possibly the use of sky cams or things like that, and just about to reach out to some arena-funded projects as well that are looking into this area. I just want to contrast this with another event on the 31st of March, where you had these large cloud bands come in, but they were more regular cloud bands, and you could see that there was a big 300 meg drop within a short period of time as well, but frequency didn't drop as much, and that was because our controllers had time to prepare. Like this drop in PV output was to some degree it was forecasted. So this is the hour ahead forecast, and you can see that here this forecast was showing quite a large drop between 12 and 1. This one did occur a bit earlier. The actual drop did occur earlier, but it did give us time to actually prepare the fleet and make sure that there was enough reserves to cater for this 300 meg deviation in rooftop PV output. So the next issue is I'll talk about is ramping and cycling. So as the belly of the duct gets deeper, the ramping requirements from the midday trough to the evening peak become more onerous. So I'm just giving an example from the minimum demand day from earlier this year. The actual largest ramps in the system occur in winter, usually around August and September, or July, August, September. At that time, we're sort of going into spring, where you actually, it's driven a lot by evening peak demand. So it's still cold, and so people are using heating and cooking and so forth at night. And so the evening peaks are higher. But this is just for illustrative purposes from the minimum demand day, where we had quite a big duck belly. The ramp from trough to peak was about 1.4 gigawatts, so it was about 134% of the load at the trough. And the ramp rate was about 4 megs per minute. And if we didn't have DER, so this is the load if we didn't have DER, so we excluded rooftop PV, this is the underlying load, then the ramp rate would have been 1.2 megaminutes. So this would have been much more consistent with our normal summer loading. And because of the nature of that day, it was a Sunday and it was cool and there was a lot of sun, we ended up getting this load. And so why this is sort of material is that we just need to get increasingly more flexible fleet as the duck belly gets deeper and deeper. And particularly in winter when the peak loads are also higher and higher and we still have duck curve effects, we're starting to see now ramps of up to 8 megs per minute. And 8 megs per minute is actually quite a lot more than what the coal fleet can actually provide. So if you had a lot of coal providing all that ramping, then you would probably not be able to achieve it. And this is a nice segue into this slide, which is the deepening duck curve is also causing all the cycling of baseload generation. So, for example, the coal-fired fleet. And here is an example from 2011, 12, and 13. So this is pre-duck curve. And you can see that there was always been some kind of cycling from the minimum loads in the morning. So this is 3 a.m. up to the evening peak and then back down again. And we're talking about a couple hundred megawatts of coal fleet cycling. So this is just the aggregate of all of the coal fleet. And now we fast forward to 2018, 2019, 2020. You can see that now that these loads in the morning are still the same, but now the daytime duck curve is causing the coal fleet now to cycle during the day as well. And so you've got now 2 cycling periods over the day. And this is causing increasing wear and tear in the coal fleet, obviously. And you can see as well that in 2020, just the average amount of coal fleet output has decreased, and that's just due to decommitments and when we looked at that pie graph, we could see that coal was being used less and less. But just a bit of perspective here, the ramping situation in the SWIS is nowhere near as bad as what's happening in California. So we're talking about 134% from the trough. California's got like 600%, 6 times the amount of ramping required at the trough. So by way of mitigations, what we're doing is we're just making sure that when on these high ramp days that we have the flexible generating plant online. So this is mainly gas turbines and they're not on outage. We have enough ramping capability. And we're now doing some additional work on the capability of the fleet to meet ramps. The next issue is we're seeing is of emerging contingency risks, and this is one of rooftop PV tripping. So what we're seeing is that during system disturbances, so really network faults, short circuits on transmission lines, they are causing voltage deviations or disturbances throughout the transmission system and then down into the distribution system. And we're seeing that a portion of rooftop PV inverters are just tripping off unintentionally. And this wasn't a problem back in 2011, 12, 13, and in the past because there was low DER penetration. But nowadays we're getting to a point where a network fault can also cause a generation contingency. So the amount of DER tripping is exceeding the amount of load tripping. So usually what we see in the past is that a network fault, you get a load rejection event. So you lose load as a result of voltage disturbances. But now we're losing load and DER in the middle of the day, and actually DER is greater than the load that we're losing. And so here's a case study from the 18th of September. There was a transmission line trip on the 132 kV system south of Perth around noon, and it caused the system load to increase by 100 megawatts due to the DER tripping. So here it is. We had 1400 megawatts. And here's the system frequency. This is the period of time where the fault occurred. And the transmission line tripped. And we had this load increase due to the net DER tripping. And as a result, we actually had a frequency deviation as well. So you have a network fault that's turning into a frequency contingency. So by itself, a network fault that leads to to DER tripping is probably not a huge risk in the SWIS because we do carry a lot of reserves for large generator trips. So our largest generator is 340 megawatts, and often our generator contingencies are above 200 megawatts. So we are carrying enough spinning reserve for these contingencies. So if DER were to trip by itself, unless it was just a major fault somewhere that took out a lot of DER, then we don't consider that a huge risk. However, it does become material when a network fault also takes out generation as well as DER. So this is an emerging issue that's happening in the north of Perth. And I mentioned earlier that we had a few wind farms come in to the system last year, and they actually came in near each other and on the same line, and it's a non-redundant line. So Yannon and Warradaji wind farms, these were just installed, came online at the end of last year, and this is a long 332 kV line that goes north of Perth. So this is the Perth area. This is up towards Geraldton Way. And if that line trips, then you basically lose all of these generators. And the only way this line really does trip, though, is when there's a transmission line fault anywhere along this line. There's a big intertrip. And so this is exactly what happened earlier this year. So we had a single-phase earth fault on this line. And if you have a fault anywhere on this line, this whole line intertrips, and you take out all these generators. And so we had a combined output of 257 megawatts from these generators tripped. The Carrara mining load trip, so that was a good thing. But then it was followed by 124 to 134 megawatts of rooftop PV inverters tripping. So the contingency size was 310 megawatts in total, roughly. And that caused frequency to deviate. And so what we've done since then is we've had to augment the RTFS tool to include an estimate for the potential amount of DER tripping after these sort of credible network contingencies. And so here's a graph from the day. This is the event. This is what was measured on the day. So we had a frequency nadir of 48.89 hertz. So it was a pretty large deviation. This is UFL stage 1. So we weren't too far off from UFLs. This is what we predicted based on just the network contingency. So we would have had enough reserves in place, and had that network contingency occurred by itself with that DER tripping, we would have got to this frequency. But actually what happened is we got to this frequency, and once we've sort of adjusted the RTFS to include DER tripping, we do sort of start seeing similar results to what we actually observed. So some ongoing analysis. There's actually quite a bit of work on in this space because this is actually happening in the NEM as well, and there's an ongoing work stream that's being led by Jenny Rees based in the NEM, and we're basically trying to refine the amount of DER and load tripping that's occurring due to network faults in the SWIS, and trying to sort of determine the most appropriate solutions. Because right now we're actually just doing this more in a heuristic basis, looking at observations from past events, but we're doing some really detailed power system modeling right now. And there's also a new arena funded project, Project Match, to investigate DER behavior during power system disturbances and help us to develop tools to manage higher penetrations. And one of the problems is we don't have that much visibility in the DER, in how much DER there is and how much is tripping. So a lot of this stuff is really just based on estimates. I've just got two more sort of issues to outline, and then we can wrap it up. So the next issue is really on the impact of DER under frequency load shedding. So the UFL scheme really is the last line of defense when frequency collapses from big generator contingencies, and when all of our primary frequency response, spinning reserve, droop, etc., has failed. And in the SWIS, the UFL scheme is actually laid out in Western Power's technical rules, and it's laid out in 5 stages at these frequencies, and they're 15% blocks, so they're uniform blocks. And the loads in each stage are really mainly sourced from distribution feeders, so and from non-essential commercial and residential customers. So basically non-hospital, non-airport, that kind of those kind of customers, they're the ones that are on the UFL scheme. But what we're finding is now a lot of these feeders are actually turning from loads into net generators. So if you shed those feeders, then you're not shedding load, you're actually shedding generation, and that would exacerbate the under frequency issues and would sort of defeat the purpose of UFLs. Here's an example from Western Power. On that day, on that minimum load day, we were seeing whole zone substations backfeeding into the system. And so you can see here, Southern River, which is in the south of Perth, was backfeeding 18 megawatts back into the system. Byford also was a large amount. And I will point out here that the largest areas where there is backfeeds is in the north of Perth, so the northern suburbs of Perth. So here's Yanchep, Padbury, North Beach, Lansdale, Henley Brook, Clarkson, sort of Beachborough, and in the southeast of Perth. So the Byford, the Southern Rivers, Rivertons of the world, and yeah, this is also in the south of Perth, so the Waikiki, Medina, and the Rockingham areas, Meadow Springs. And what you'll notice is that in the Perth CBD itself, like here, this is Cannington Terminal, this is Western Terminal, you'll see that the loads are largely positive and are unaffected by DER. This is mainly because it's just in the CBD and there's just not a lot of rooftop PV penetration in the commercial space as yet. So this is the effect that we're having of UFLs on or the effect of DER on the UFLs. And DER has really eroded the availability of UFLs in the middle of the day. And you can see our target here is 15%, so it should be blue. So if this is stage 1, we're looking to be blue for the whole day, but actually in the middle of the day, especially in that October period, we're down at 9.5%. So we're really eroding the amount of UFLs that we have. And that's sort of spread across the first few stages. And what you find is that as you get to the upper stage, the lower stages, right, stage 5, you find that it's sort of more constant. And in fact, it's reversed, which is interesting because these are more CBD feeders. So they have load during the middle of the day and during the daytime hours, and then less load in the evenings. So they have the opposite effect. And so the obvious thing that we've done is we've actually just swapped a couple of these out into, we've swapped a couple of these feeders out from stage 5 to stage 1 and 2. Oh, actually Western Power have. And it really has improved the UFL's availability. You know, if you had a cloudy winter day, it doesn't really matter. whether the original and the rebalanced one is fairly much around the target. But it's really in these sunny spring days where you see that real erosion in the middle of the day. And once we've rebalanced it, it's all now back up to the 15% mark, which is good. So it's less compromised, but we are now compromising the later stages of UFLS. Hopefully we don't get that. So there's an ongoing work being done as part of the DER roadmap, Action 10, and that's to review the UFLS scheme. So there's quite a lot of studies currently being done to possibly even redesign UFLS, whether or not we need 5 uniform stages or we need smaller stages and more adaptive stages is something we're actually looking into right now. And lastly, the impact of DER on system restart. So we had the unfortunate situation where we went to system black condition. We'd have to restart the system from specific power stations that we contracted for system restart services. And the old restart philosophy, this is going back to the 90s, prioritised the re-energisation of coal-fired power plants in that Collie Basin area around Mooja. And that involved basically starting from around here, which is where one of the restart sources are, and then building a loop around and basically energising a large 330 kV line out to Mooja. And the reason back then why we needed it was because we didn't have that much gas. So in the 90s to now, we've brought on a lot of gas and a lot more generation. And in the past, we've needed all that coal generation to basically supply load to the SWIS. However, things have changed, and now the DER, increasing DER has actually reduced the availability of stabilising load in these areas. So we had a system black event in the middle of the day, and we tried to do this. We wouldn't get enough load to actually energise this line, because you just need stabilising load to energise this line and make sure that the generators remain stable. And we just wouldn't have enough load in some of these areas in the North Metro area. So we really had to change our philosophy. And like I said before, a lot of the loads in the CBD are really invariant of rooftop PV and DER, and they're quite stable. So now the new philosophy is really to target the Perth metro area. So we were starting from here, we just go through the guts of the city and target stable load. And you know, this is also helped by the fact that we now have generation, a lot of gas generation in the metro area as well, to be able to support these loads. And the DER an explicit consideration of DER has been central to developing the new system restart plan. So each restart strategy that we have from each of the sources is validated against the minimum load day with maximum penetration of rooftop PV. So we basically, the thinking is that if it works in that min load day, it'll work on every other day. Perth CBD substations are targeted early, as I said. Some zone substations, like what we're talking about, Southern River, Lansdale, Henry Brook, they're passed through because they backfeed. So we can't afford to energise some of these substations because they would sort of we actually need load in the early stages of restart, and if they were backfeeding, that would potentially cause some of our generators to reverse power. And we've highly flexible gas generation is then prioritised for energisation to just accommodate for all this DER. So this is our last slide. Just in conclusion, DER has become one of the key challenges in operating the SWIS, and it's really affected almost every area of system operations, as you've just seen. And the appropriate management, incentivisation, and incentivising DER to participate into the market is becoming really now central to the longer term policy planning. And this has been acknowledged by the WA government and through initiatives like the DER roadmap and the WEM reform process. So I think Jai Thomas spoke at the Energy Transition Hub a couple of months ago, and we talked about the DER roadmap. And these things are really now front in mind And what we're hoping is with all these initiatives in place that future DER growth will serve to support rather than destabilise the SWIS. Thanks.
Okay, that was great, Julius. Thank you so much. I see that we're running close to our time. So would you have about another 10 minutes to stay around for questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So for those of you who submitted questions, I'll be inviting you to unmute your audio and ask your question live. And if you're not able to do so, I can ask a question on your behalf. But before you're asking a question, just please introduce yourself with your name and affiliation. And so the first question we've got is from Aditya. Okay, you're unmuted. Okay, in that case, I'll ask the question on your behalf. So by 2030, the percentage of renewable sources are going to increase or going to double. So at the same time, the retirement of coal power plants are inevitable. So how does AMO planning to address the issue of renewable energy spillage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, our role in AMO is really in terms of just system management and operation. So we take policy decisions as given when we try and drive the policy agenda to a certain extent. But through all of the operational tools and things that I've been outlining, this is basically what we're trying to just maintain system stability through the operation. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I guess it's for us, we have a probably not a, certainly in system management, we don't have a very long-term view of where it's going from a policy perspective. We try and aid the discussion, but certainly we're looking at how do we operate the system this spring and next summer, that kind of thing.
Okay, great. I'd like to invite Brad Smart to ask your question. Okay. Oh, there's two of them.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I just wanted to get an understanding of how much the transmission event and the PV tripping was a result of inverters not having the appropriate ride-through settings capability or settings, given there was the implementation of like VoltVar from Western Power earlier or last year.
Yeah, good question, Brad. A lot of it is to do with ride-through capability, and a lot of it is to do with just old inverters. So a lot of these new initiatives, so AS4777, some of the newer versions of AS4777, particularly the newest version, will address some of these issues. But you still have this big fleet of old inverters, going back to early 2000s that are just not compliant, I guess. When I say not compliant, but they do trip off and have no expectation of staying on.
Further to that, I've seen reports from the eastern states where existing inverters are not actually being installed with the correct settings. Is there anything you can comment on that? Because that seems to be a compliance issue for installers. Yeah,
that's probably quite an insightful comment, Brad. There was some work being done by UNSW that bench tested inverters, both pre-2015 and post. And there are some inverters even now that are still not compliant. That's true. But we're hoping that proportion is decreasing over time.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We've got another question, unfortunately, from an anonymous attendee, but so I'll ask them the question. So have you utilized the voltage control capabilities of DERs, and have you imposed grid connection requirements for these resources to help with the voltage control problems that you're seeing?
No, I mean, that's not AMO's remit. That would be within Western Power remit, but I think that's something that will happen in the future for sure.
Okay, great. And another one from the anonymous attendee. Why is there a significant difference in actual PFI and RTFS after the response activation? And do you know what contributes to this difference?
Yeah, so I mentioned that we have IPPs in the system as well, and through the technical rules, they have mandatory drip. So in our RTFS, we don't include the IPPs because they technically, we only include spinning reserve that is contracted. and that we know will perform, or we've actually contracted to perform. So there's actually just other PFR in the system. And also our TFS only includes DRUIT. And once you get past sort of that 15, 20-second timescale, you're now into AGC timescales. And so you're looking at secondary responses coming into play. So from the automatic generation control system.
Okay, great. I've got a couple of questions here from a couple of the Q&A asking about the ability of DER to contribute to system restart. Is that a capability that AEMO is developing? And would you better speak to that?
That's also a very good question. Ideally, yes, but they would have to all be grid forming. You'd have to have battery behind. Right now, there's no ability for DER to contribute because they're just uncontrolled, and we have no means to control DER at any level at the moment. So hopefully that's something that can really support in the future as more battery energy storage comes into play, and especially grid forming supplies.
Okay, great. This is a similar question from Tejas Kumar. That was okay. Remaining questions. So, do you have any plan or suggestions to enhance frequency withstand capability of PV inverters? And is AEMO considering this? And would it be more sustainable than having a reserve for this?
Yes, that is. I mean, the reserve that we're putting in right now is really trying to be temporary. We would prefer that the DER don't trip, obviously, and so there is efforts underway, driven by the NEM, like Jenny Reese's team in the NEM, to beef up the standards, and some of that does include frequency standards. So the frequency ones are less of a problem than the voltage ride-through ones. I think most of them are driven through voltage disturbances rather than frequency disturbance. I should point that out, that when we have a generator contingency and we only have a frequency event, we don't see as much DER tripping. We only really see it when there's a voltage event associated, like a line fault.
Okay, great. I guess this question was mostly covered over your whole presentation about the risk that you expect in terms of system strength. But overall, given that the forecast of Rooftop and DER is continually increasing, how far has AEMO proceeded with the smart inverter standards and this implementation within the SWIS network?
Again, we have no remit to enforce any standards in WA, and that's something that, again, would be more of a Western Power thing. I mean, we would love it to see it happen. Again, for these reasons that I've outlined, like the DER tripping, as well as all the other issues that are associated with it, including volt buff, that would be really good for the new inverters to be installed, to have all these capabilities. Having said that, there's actually just a large stock of old inverters that we still need to manage.
Okay, great. So I guess that closes out our questions for today. Thank you so much for your presentation and the time that you spent. It's been wonderful to hear to what extent DER's causing a headache in the operation room, and all the fantastic engineering that goes around having to actually manage all of this and being respectful for the strategies that are actually required to mitigate the risks. So I'd like to just put out our final notice in terms of our final webinar. So the final webinar, this Victorian Clean Energy Fund webinar series, will be from Dr. Sarah Russell-Smith from Amber Electric. And for those of you not familiar with them, they're a retailer who offers wholesale electricity price pass-through so that your retail electricity bill reflects what the wholesale market is. And she'll be presenting on the development and use of their customer load shifting platform called SmartShift. And that will be occurring on Wednesday, the 12th of May at 11 a.m. And for more details of these and other upcoming events, please visit the Climate Energy College and Energy Transition Hub websites. And I'd like to thank all of you very much for attending. And thank you so much, Julius, for your presentation. So this draws the webinar to a close. And thank you, everybody.